Imagine waking up tomorrow to headlines screaming, Japan dumps U.S. treasuries, markets in free fall. Now, for most Americans, that might sound like Wall Street noise, abstract, distant, not something that affects your everyday life. But here's the truth. When a country like Japan, which holds over $1 trillion in U.S. debt, even threatens to sell, it sends shockwaves through the economy. Interest rates, inflation, even your retirement savings could get caught in the storm. And that's exactly what happened during Trump's early presidency. Tensions flared in a way we hadn't seen in decades. One of our closest allies suddenly signaling they felt disrespected. Not just in passing, but enough to hint at a financial move that could rattle the global system. So what caused that? Why would Japan, a pillar of stability in the Pacific, go from cautious cooperation to subtle economic saber-rattling? Today we're unpacking the chain of missteps, half-truths, and dramatic gestures that led us to that edge. From Trump's unfulfilled trade promises to the bizarre bowling ball test story that Japan quietly ridiculed. From moments of silent dignity in Tokyo to chaotic bluster in Washington. From China to urging Japan to form a united front with South Korea. To American consumers quietly paying the price at the checkout line. But this isn't just about the past. It's about patterns. How leaders treat allies. How economic diplomacy either strengthens trust or weakens it beyond repair. Stick with me, because by the end of this journey, you'll see why what happened between Trump and Japan wasn't just a one-off headline. It was a stress test for America's global credibility. And maybe, just maybe, a wake-up call for what it truly means to lead in a world that's always watching. Ready? Let's start at the moment Japan raised its voice, not in anger, but in warning. What would it take for a country like Japan to even hint at selling off U.S. treasuries? That's not something Tokyo throws around lightly. In April of Trump's first 100 days, Japan's finance ministry made a statement that raised eyebrows across global markets. They warned, subtly but unmistakably, that if they were treated with disrespect in trade negotiations, they might reconsider their holdings of U.S. government debt. Now, on the surface, that might sound like a polite diplomatic nudge. But in the language of geopolitics, especially between allies, that's a warning flare. Let's put this in perspective. Japan is the second largest foreign holder of U.S. debt after China. Over $1 trillion treasuries. If they actually sold off a large chunk, it would spike interest rates, devalue the dollar, and ripple across global markets. Think of mortgages getting more expensive, 401ks losing value, or borrowing costs going up for small businesses. But here's the twist. Did Japan really intend to pull the trigger? Or was this more about saving face? In my view, this was less about economics and more about signaling strength. Japanese culture, especially in government, is deeply rooted in dignity and mutual respect. Trump's aggressive style, public claims of winning trade wars, and exaggerations about car tariffs weren't just misleading. They were humiliating. For example, he claimed Japan imposed tariffs on American cars when in fact Japan's tariffs are zero. What actually blocks U.S. auto sales, there are safety standards and consumer preferences, not government restrictions. So imagine being a Japanese negotiator, hearing those accusations broadcast on American TV, and then being told to sit down at the table like nothing happened. That statement about treasuries was Japan saying, "We're not a doormat." It was a quiet but potent reminder that even the most loyal allies have leverage and pride. Now, do I think they would have actually sold off those bonds? Probably not. It would have hurt Japan too. They rely on the stability of U.S. debt to back their own economy. But that wasn't the point. The point was to draw a red line without shouting, to remind the White House that diplomacy isn't a game show, and your allies aren't contestants to be humiliated. This moment was a test of mutual respect, and in many ways a missed opportunity for deeper cooperation. And it makes you wonder what would have happened if the U.S. had listened more carefully instead of doubling down on spectacle. Coming up next, we'll take a closer look at those broken promises, the trade deals with Japan and India that Trump talked about constantly but never delivered, and why, when it comes to foreign policy, headlines aren't enough. You have to finish what you start. We've all heard the phrase, the art of the deal. But what happens when the only thing delivered is the performance? During Trump's first 100 days, he repeatedly promised bold new trade agreements with Japan and India. There were photo ops, grand declarations, and headlines that made it seem like deals were right around the corner. But fast forward, no deals. Not with Japan, not with India, just a lot of noise and very little substance. Let's take Japan first. Trump claimed he was fixing the unfair trade imbalance with Japan. He said American farmers would get better access, that the auto industry would win big. He even pushed the idea of a bilateral agreement after pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Japan remained in without the US, and yet there was no breakthrough. The mini deal that came much later was limited in scope. It included some agriculture and digital trade, but left out auto tariffs, one of Trump's loudest complaints. Japan gave just enough to avoid escalation. That wasn't a win, it was damage control. India was a similar story. Trump called Prime Minister Modi a great friend. They had rallies together. Remember Namaste Trump? He promised a big, beautiful trade agreement. But again, nothing materialized. Negotiations stalled over tariffs on dairy and medical devices, data localization rules, and India's demand for restoration of its developing country trade benefits. From a distance, it might have looked like progress. But if you dig a little deeper, it was mostly performative. Great TV, sure, but diplomacy isn't reality television. And honestly, here's where I feel a bit frustrated as a citizen. Because trade policy affects real people, workers, small businesses, consumers. When we're told deals are being made, we expect follow-through, not empty podiums and broken promises. It's easy to stand in front of a crowd and say America first. It's harder to do the work. Listen, negotiate, compromise, and actually get results. Deals don't happen just because you want them. They take patience, precision, and most of all, trust. And trust, once broken, takes far longer to rebuild. The missed opportunities here weren't just political, they were strategic losses. We could have strengthened alliances, opened new markets, and shaped the global trade landscape to our values. Instead, we left space for others to lead. Now, speaking of trust and respect, what happens when your closest ally publicly challenges your version of events? In the next part, we'll dive into how Japan pushed back, not just diplomatically, but rhetorically, calling out Trump's misstatements and making it clear they would not be used as a political prop. Have you ever heard a story so strange you had to pause and ask yourself, wait, did that really happen? Well, let me take you back to one of the more surreal moments in early US-Japan trade talks under Trump. In a 2017 speech, Trump claimed, completely seriously, that Japanese car makers drop bowling balls on American-made cars to prove their low quality. Yes, you heard that right. Bowling balls. It would have been laugh-out-loud funny if it weren't part of actual trade policy rhetoric. This bizarre claim was quickly mocked across media in Japan, and the US automotive experts couldn't find a shred of truth to it. In fact, no such bowling ball test exists in Japanese auto regulation. What made it worse was that the claim came amid already tense negotiations about car tariffs and trade imbalances. So instead of strengthening America's position, the statement weakened our credibility. Now let's contrast that with real history. Back in the 1980s, we did have serious auto trade tensions with Japan. Japanese imports were dominating the US market, and American manufacturers were struggling. Reagan's administration negotiated voluntary export restraints with Japan, limiting the number of cars they could send to the US. It wasn't perfect, but it was a calculated, structured approach, and it acknowledged the complexity of the problem. Compare that to the bowling ball test. One approach is rooted in policy, the other in performance. And here's my personal take. When you reduce trade negotiation to theater, it's not just embarrassing, it's risky. Because the people listening aren't just American voters. They're policymakers in Tokyo, investors in Frankfurt, and diplomats in Seoul. They're taking notes. And when we replace facts with fiction, they remember. I know for many of us, especially those who've worked in manufacturing or have family in those sectors, These deals and disputes are not abstract. They're personal. They shape job security, economic growth, and even our kids' futures. So we need leadership that treats these issues with the seriousness they deserve. Now, that's not to say humor has no place in politics. Satire can highlight hypocrisy. But when satire becomes your policy, we've got a problem. Let's keep going. Because Japan wasn't just rolling its eyes behind closed doors. They pushed back, strongly. And next, we'll explore how one Japanese politician likened the U.S. trade demands to something much darker: extortion. Sometimes diplomacy speaks loudest when it says very little. While President Trump was tweeting in all caps and throwing verbal grenades across the Pacific, Japan responded in a completely different tone: measured, composed, and almost unsettlingly calm. When Japan's press secretary stood before the cameras after a particularly turbulent trade meeting, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't lash out. Instead, he calmly reiterated Japan's position, emphasizing mutual respect and long-term cooperation. To some viewers, that might have seemed weak, but if you know Japanese political culture, you know that wasn't weakness. That was discipline. That was power wrapped in restraint. This isn't just a matter of personality. It's a reflection of two entirely different diplomatic traditions. The U.S., especially under Trump, often defaults to transactional negotiation. It's a deal-making mindset, fast, bold, and centered around leverage. Japan, on the other hand, draws from a long history of consensus building. Relationships come first. Face-saving matters, and shouting across the table? That's not negotiation. That's humiliation. One senior Japanese official, when asked about Trump's unpredictability, simply said, "We do not wish to interpret emotion. We respond to policy." That's a masterclass in redirecting the conversation. No insults, no drama, just a clean pivot back to substance. Personally, I admire that approach. Because in diplomacy, chaos isn't strategy, it's noise. And while loudness might dominate headlines, it rarely leads to lasting outcomes. Now, I know some folks watching might say, hey, sometimes you need a strong man to shake things up. Fair point. But here's the thing. Strength isn't the same as unpredictability. And when allies like Japan begin questioning not just what you want, but how you're trying to get it, the cost can be long-term. We've seen it happen. Public trust frays, alliances grow brittle, and partners, like Japan, start looking elsewhere for leadership. That's not just theoretical. During these trade tensions, Japan quietly deepened ties with the EU and recommitted to regional agreements like the CPTPP, moves that signaled, we're not waiting on America to figure itself out. To me, that's a warning we need to hear, because if we alienate allies through chaos, we're not just losing deals, we're losing influence. And once that influence is gone, it's hard to get back. Next, let's talk about what that shift in influence actually looks like, on the ground, in the markets, and behind closed doors. Starting with how financial rumors during these trade battles sparked real panic and profit. Ever wonder what the rest of the world was thinking while all this US-Japan trade drama unfolded? Spoiler alert, they weren't just watching, they were responding, and not always in America's favor. Let's zoom out for a second. While Trump was making headlines with one-liners and tariff threats, Beijing saw an opening. China's foreign ministry reached out to Japan, urging them to coordinate with South Korea on a joint response. It wasn't just about trade, it was about power, influence, and who gets to write the rules of the next decade. This kind of diplomatic triangulation is classic Chinese strategy, and it works best when the US is distracted or self-isolating. When Washington is busy picking fights with allies, Beijing quietly invites those same allies to the table, with promises of stability and predictability. Now, let's be clear, Japan hasn't suddenly become best friends with China. There's deep mistrust there, historical scars, strategic rivalry. But in the world of international politics, alignment isn't always about friendship. Sometimes it's just about managing chaos. And from Tokyo's perspective in 2017, Washington was feeling a little chaotic. South Korea also found itself caught in the middle, Remember, this was during heightened tensions on the Korean Peninsula. Every move from Trump, every ambiguous tweet, every off-script remark had consequences. Seoul needed coordination. Instead, it often got confusion. And in Europe, leaders quietly stepped up their trade game. The EU signed a landmark free trade deal with Japan in 2018, largely in response to fears that the US was abandoning its leadership role in global trade. That deal cut tariffs on nearly 99% of goods traded between the two powers, a direct counterweight to Trump's unilateral approach. As someone who believes in strong American alliances, this part hurts a little, because I don't think we lost influence because others outplayed us. I think we handed it away through erratic moves, inconsistent messaging, and a refusal to play the long game. But here's what gives me hope. These relationships aren't broken beyond repair. They're strained, sure, but if we take the time to listen, to actually understand how our allies perceive us, we can rebuild that trust. Not just with power, but with presence. Next, we're going to take a closer look at exactly what was lost and what we risk continuing to lose if America keeps turning its back on the rules-based alliances that once made it a global leader. Because the ripple effects aren't just diplomatic, they hit our markets, our workers, and our future. Let's bring it home for a moment, because it's easy to treat foreign policy like it's something far away. Distant negotiations, abstract deals, leaders in suits behind closed doors. But what happens on the global stage eventually lands right on our kitchen tables. So here's the real question. What does all of this, trade threats, shaky alliances, erratic diplomacy, actually mean for everyday Americans? Let's start with jobs. When tariffs go up, American manufacturers don't just get protected, they also get cut off. In 2018, for instance, when Trump raised tariffs on Japanese steel and aluminum, Japan didn't just shrug, they retaliated. And that meant higher costs for American companies relying on imported materials, especially in auto manufacturing and construction. Jobs that once seemed stable suddenly became more expensive to maintain. And if you're thinking, well, that's just business, let's talk about prices. Tariffs are, in effect, taxes on imports. And who ends up paying those taxes? Not Japan, not China. You and me, American consumers. Take autos. If Japanese car makers face higher costs to sell in the US, they either raise their prices or pull back supply. That means fewer choices, higher prices at the dealership, and less leverage for buyers. Even domestically made cars often rely on foreign parts, so the pain spreads. But beyond dollars and cents, there's something even bigger at stake. Trust. Trust in America's word, trust in our leadership. Trust that when we commit to an agreement, we honor it. Not just for one term or one administration, but for the long haul. Alliances are built on more than just interests. They're built on consistency. And when that breaks, when we swing between extremes every 4 years, our partners hesitate. They hedge their bets, and they begin forming ties elsewhere. I've spoken with small business owners, union workers, and even retired diplomats who all say the same thing. Uncertainty is the enemy of progress. It's hard to hire, hard to plan, hard to grow, when the rules keep changing with every press conference. That's why this matters. It's not just about Japan. It's about whether America can still be trusted to lead. Not through force, but through fairness, through stability, through example. And that brings us to our final question, one we all need to sit with. What kind of leadership do we really want to project to the world? Because in our final segment, we'll pull all of this together. The threats, the theater, the global ripple effects, and how we, as citizens, can respond with clarity, with purpose, and with power. So let's wrap this up. Today we've seen that Japan's warning about selling off US treasuries wasn't just a random threat, it was a wake-up call. A reminder that when countries like Japan feel disrespected or ignored, the consequences ripple through the entire global economy. We've also dug into Trump's unfulfilled promises on trade with Japan and India, and how those broken deals have only fueled the uncertainty surrounding America's position in the world. And let's not forget the stark contrast between Japan's calm calculated diplomacy, and Trump's chaotic, often unpredictable approach. This isn't just about Japan or even just about America. It's about global stability. The world watches how we engage, how we negotiate, and how we lead. Now think about it. What does all of this mean for us as citizens of the world's most powerful country? Is it in our best interest to continue a path of erratic leadership and unstable alliances? Or do we want to build a future that is grounded in trust, respect, and consistency? I encourage you to reflect on the cost of all this drama, because while it might seem far removed from our day-to-day lives, the reality is it touches us all, our jobs, our prices, our long-term stability. When the world can't count on America to keep its word, we all feel the consequences. So what do you think? If you believe diplomacy should always beat drama, hit that subscribe button. Join me in this conversation, because together we can push for a future where diplomacy leads the way, calm, steady, and strong. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.